Today, not one of the 10 largest machine tool companies on Earth is American. The United States, the country that once built more machine tools than any nation in history, now ranks 5th in global production. But there was a time when one American city dominated this industry so completely that it earned a title no other city has held before or since. A city on the Ohio River, where 50 companies built the machines that built everything else. This is the story of how that dominance was forged. This is Trade Archive. If this story earns your attention, hit like and subscribe. The story starts with a river. In the 1820s, Cincinnati sat at the bend of the Ohio River, the gateway between the eastern seaboard and the frontier west. Everything heading downriver to the Mississippi passed through. Everything heading north to the Great Lakes would soon pass through too, because on July 21, 1825, Ohio broke ground on the Miami and Erie Canal at Middletown. When the Cincinnati to Dayton segment opened to traffic in 1828, it connected the Ohio River to the interior by water for the first time. The first boats reached Dayton on January 25, 1829. The full 274-mile canal, stretching all the way to Toledo and Lake Erie, would take until 1845 to complete. But even that first segment transformed the city overnight. Real estate values in Cincinnati rose 20 to 25% in the 3 years after the canal opened. Commerce quadrupled between 1826 and 1832. Cincinnati's population nearly doubled in a decade. In 1830, 24,831. By 1840, 46,338. By 1850, it would reach 115,000, making it the 6th largest city in the United States. The canal and the river together made Cincinnati a crossroads where raw materials poured in from the west and finished goods flowed back out to the east. And what Cincinnati had, above all else, was pork. The surrounding Ohio Valley produced hogs in quantities that staggered even the most ambitious butchers. By 1840, the city housed 48 packing plants employing over 1,200 men. They called it Porkopolis, and the name stuck because the numbers earned it. The lard byproducts from all that pork spawned Procter & Gamble in 1837, and the Emery Candle Works in 1840. But pork was only the beginning of the demand for metalwork. Steamboat traffic on the Ohio peaked at 8,000 arrivals and departures in a single year. Those boats needed boilers, engines, valves, and fittings. The packers needed saws, presses, grinders, and rendering equipment. Cincinnati's carriage makers, soap manufacturers, and iron foundries all needed metal shaped to tolerances they could not yet produce locally. By 1826, the city already had 6 foundries and several steam engine builders. The demand for precision metalworking was everywhere. The supply was almost nowhere. Then the Germans arrived. Following the failed revolutions of 1848, a wave of German immigrants poured into Cincinnati. They settled in a neighborhood just north of the canal that became known as Over the Rhine, named because residents crossed the canal the way they once crossed the river that divided Germany. By 1850, roughly 27% of the city's population was German-born. By 1890, 57% of Cincinnati's nearly 300,000 residents were either born in Germany or had German parents. In Over the Rhine alone, 63% of residents were German-born in 1850, and by the end of the century, that figure reached 75%. They came from Prussia, Bavaria, and Saxony, and they brought something Cincinnati needed desperately: the continental tradition of precision metalwork. Clockmakers who could cut gears to fractions of a millimeter. Die makers and stamp cutters who had trained in shops where 1/100th of an inch was considered sloppy. Instrument builders, printers, toolmakers, and machinists who understood metal not just as material, but as a medium that rewarded patience and punished shortcuts. The 48ers, as they were called, were political refugees carrying artisan skills that had no obvious outlet in a young frontier city. But Cincinnati's booming industries gave those skills exactly the outlet they needed. The reception was not always warm. In April 1855, nativist know-nothing mobs attacked Over the Rhine. chanting at the German residents from the canal bridges. German militia barricaded the neighborhood and held them off. The hostility faded, but the skills stayed. German immigrants founded Cincinnati's printing industry, its brewery culture, and a growing number of its metalworking shops. The founding families of the machine tool companies that would dominate the next century, the Holzes, the Muellers, the Geyers, were all German or first-generation German-American. The demand was already there. The Germans brought the hands. One man arrived before the Great Wave, and his story sets the stage for everything that follows. Miles Greenwood was born March 19, 1807, in New Jersey. He moved to Cincinnati with his father in 1817, spent 4 years in Robert Owen's utopian community at New Harmony, Indiana, and worked in a Pittsburgh iron foundry before returning to Cincinnati in 1829. In 1832, at age 25, he partnered with Joseph Webb and opened the Eagle Iron Works on the bank of the Miami and Erie Canal between Main and Walnut Streets. They started with 10 men and borrowed capital. By the early 1850s, Eagle Iron Works employed 350 hands and produced $360,000 worth of goods a year. Hydraulic presses, steam engines, iron building fronts, and hardware of every description. It was the largest foundry west of the Appalachians. Greenwood was not just an ironmaster. After a devastating fire at his own works in 1852 exposed the failure of Cincinnati's volunteer firefighters, he partnered with locksmith Abel Schock and locomotive builder Alexander Bonner Latta to build the Uncle Joe Ross, the first practical steam-powered fire engine in American history. It was demonstrated to the City Council on New Year's Day, 1853. 3 months later, on April 1st, Cincinnati organized the first professional, fully paid fire department in the United States, and Miles Greenwood became its first chief. He was a man who saw a problem, built the machine to solve it, and changed the institution around it. That instinct was about to be tested on a scale he could never have imagined. When the Civil War erupted in April 1861, Greenwood's Eagle Iron Works became the Union Army's Western arsenal almost overnight. His first contribution was a dozen iron pontoon bridge anchors ordered by General John C. Fremont, reportedly produced in 24 hours. That was a warm-up. The federal government contracted Greenwood to convert 10,000 obsolete Austrian muskets from flintlock to percussion. Then came the larger task, rifling smoothbore muskets for the state of Ohio. By the end of 1861, Eagle Iron Works had rifled approximately 23,482 guns, a mix of Model 1816 and Model 1842 muskets. The first 1,000 altered arms were delivered July 24, 1861. Greenwood's conversions were carried by the 41st Ohio Infantry at Shiloh and the 51st Ohio at Perryville. He also cast hundreds of artillery pieces in iron and bronze, built 3 turrets for ironclad gunboats in the Navy's river fleet, and produced 24 cannon for the Ohio National Guard in 1864. Eagle Iron Works also took on production of the first 6 Gatling guns ever manufactured. Those guns never reached the battlefield. Confederate sympathizers from across the river in Kentucky set fire to the foundry, destroying the Gatling guns, along with patent models, drawings, and prototypes. Greenwood's works were set ablaze 3 times during the war. He rebuilt every time, and he was not the only one building. Across Cincinnati, dozens of foundries, boiler shops, and machine works shifted to war production. The city's metalworking infrastructure, built to serve steamboats and meatpackers, turned out to be ideally suited for turning out the hardware of industrial warfare. The Civil War permanently embedded the interchangeable parts approach of the American system of manufactures in Cincinnati's industrial culture. The same methodology of interchangeable parts, sequential machine operations, and tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch that had been pioneered at Springfield Armory and in Connecticut's Precision Valley was now standard practice on the banks of the Ohio River. A generation of Cincinnati machinists had learned, under the pressure of wartime contracts, how to build machines that build things at volumes and precisions nobody had thought possible a few years earlier. When the war ended, the government contracts vanished. Greenwood returned to commercial iron production, served on the Cincinnati City Council and the Railway Board of Trustees, and remained in the foundry business until his death of bronchitis in November 1885. He was buried at Spring Grove Cemetery, a few miles from the canal bank where he had started with 10 men and borrowed capital 53 years earlier. But the skills he and his contemporaries had forged did not die with the war. The machinists trained in wartime production stayed in Cincinnati. They knew how to hold tolerances, how to work to specifications, how to run a production floor. They were waiting for something to build. And 700 miles east in Hartford, Connecticut, two young men were learning the craft that would give them their answer. The Pratt & Whitney factory in Hartford was, in the 1860s and the 1870s, the finest school of precision machining in America. Founded by Francis Pratt and Amos Whitney, it produced machine tools and precision instruments that set the standard for the entire industry. Two young men entered its orbit from the same starting point, the Exeter Machine Works in Exeter, New Hampshire. Worcester Reed Warner was born May 16, 1846, on a farm near Cummington, Massachusetts. He arrived at Exeter as an apprentice in 1866. Ambrose Swayze, born December 19, 1846, in Exeter itself, the ninth of 10 children on a 250-acre farm, had begun his apprenticeship the year before. The two met on the shop floor, and when they completed their training in 1870, they entered Pratt & Whitney together. Warner rose to manage an assembly floor. Swayze became foreman of the gear-cutting department, where he invented an epicycloidal milling machine for cutting true gear tooth curves. In 1876, Pratt & Whitney sent Warner to manage their massive exhibit at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, a 49-machine display that announced American precision manufacturing to the world. Both men left the company in May 1880. They pooled their savings and opened a shop in Chicago. Within a year, they judged the city too far west and short on skilled mechanics, so they moved. In March 1881, Warner and Swayze set up in a 3-story brick factory on what is now Carnegie Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, near the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Railway. Cleveland offered what they needed: a deep pool of trained mechanics, proximity to iron and steel suppliers, and rail and lake transport in every direction. They built turret lathes. A turret lathe replaced the conventional lathe's tailstock with a hexagonal indexing turret holding 6 different cutting tools. The turret rotated to bring each tool into position for sequential operations without stopping to retool. In skilled hands, a turret lathe could produce finished brass fittings, sewing machine parts, and bicycle components at speeds no conventional lathe could touch. Their #1 turret lathe, introduced in 1888, was widely regarded as the first truly practical production turret lathe, and it established Warner and Swayze as the name in the field. But Warner and Swayze also built something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with production machining and everything to do with who they were. In the mid-1880s, they were commissioned to design and construct the mounting for the 36-inch Great Lick refractor at Lick Observatory on Mount Hamilton in California. It was a project that had nothing to do with production machining and everything to do with pushing the limits of what precision metalworking could achieve. Alvin Clark & Sons ground the lens, a 36-inch disc of flint glass that weighed over 300 pounds. Warner and Swayze built everything that held it. The tube was 57 feet of rolled Pittsburgh plate steel, tapering from its full diameter to just 4 feet at the center to resist flexure under its own weight. The equatorial mounting allowed the entire assembly, tube, lens, counterweights, and observer's chair to track the rotation of the sky with a smoothness that no vibration or wind gust could disrupt. Every gear, every bearing, every pivot point had to be machined to tolerances that made their turret lathe work look rough by comparison. The telescope saw its first light on January 3, 1888. The first attempt revealed the focal length had been miscalculated by 6 inches. Swayze sawed 6 inches off the tube on the spot on a mountaintop in California using hand tools. 4 days later, they pointed it at Saturn. The image was perfect. For 9 years, the Lick refractor was the largest refracting telescope in the world, until the 40-inch Yerkes refractor surpassed it. That telescope was also mounted by Warner and Swayze. Their own 50th anniversary book later admitted the giant telescope work was unprofitable overall, calling it a labor of technological love. Machine tools paid the bills. Telescopes fed the soul. That dual identity, industrial grind and scientific beauty, made Warner and Swasey unlike any machine tool company on Earth. The influence of Warner and Swasey, though, was not limited to what they built. It extended to who they trained. And this is where the story branches into a genealogy that stretches across the entire Midwest. Frank Kempsmith worked under Warner and Swasey in Cleveland before leaving for Milwaukee in 1888 to found the Kempsmith Manufacturing Company, building milling machines. At Kempsmith, a young German-American machinist named Theodore Trecker, born in 1868 on a farm near LaSalle, Illinois, learned the trade that would define his life. He had moved to Milwaukee at 18 and completed a 3-year apprenticeship at a sawmill machinery maker before joining Kempsmith, where he met draftsman E.J. Kearney. On May 17, 1898, the two would found Kearney and Trecker, one of the 3 largest milling machine builders in America. But that story belongs to the next episode. In 1891, George Bardens and John Oliver, both former Warner and Swasey officials, opened their own turret lathe company at 3 Water Street in Cleveland. Bardens and Oliver started by making bicycle hubs and the machines to make them, then expanded into hand-operated turret lathes and large-capacity cutoff machines for the pipe and tube industry. George Bardens died in 1924, but the Oliver family retained the business for over a century. It still operates today. In Hartford, 2 more Pratt & Whitney men were about to change Cleveland's future. Edwin C. Henn and Reinhold Hakewessel spent more than a decade trying to solve one of manufacturing's most persistent bottlenecks. Every factory in America that used screws, fittings, valve stems, or fasteners depended on single spindle machines operated by skilled hands, one workpiece at a time. The bottleneck was killing production rates across every industry that ran on small turned metal parts, and nobody had figured out how to break it. In 1894, they patented the first multiple spindle automatic lathe. Instead of one workpiece and one set of tools, their machine held several workpieces at once, each advancing through a different cutting operation simultaneously. When the cycle completed, every spindle had produced a finished part. They founded the Acme Screw Machine Company in Hartford in 1895, but the capital to scale was not in Connecticut. Henn sent his brother to Cleveland for investment. In 1901, the 2 firms merged to form the National Acme Manufacturing Company, and the multi-spindle automatic lathe found its home on the shores of Lake Erie. One factory's apprentice bench in Hartford, Connecticut, had seeded an entire region's industry. Pratt & Whitney to Warner and Swasey, Warner and Swasey to Kempsmith, to Bardens and Oliver, Kempsmith to Trecker, Pratt & Whitney to Henn, Hakewessel, and National Acme. The bloodline was real, it was traceable, and it would matter for the next 100 years. If you have been watching Trade Archive for any length of time, you know that the machines and companies we cover on this channel are not abstractions. They are the machines in your shops, the names on your headstocks, the companies your fathers and grandfathers worked for. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, subscribe, because the rest of this series goes deeper. But the Hartford genealogy was only half the story. Back in Cincinnati, a parallel lineage was forming, and it traced not to Connecticut, but to a man who had worked for Miles Greenwood himself. John Steptoe was a foundling, born around 1804 in Oldham, in the industrial north of England. He emigrated to America in the late 1840s, arrived in Cincinnati around 1850, and went to work at Greenwood's Eagle Iron Works. He learned the foundry trade under Greenwood, absorbed the production methods the war years would later amplify, and then struck out on his own. In partnership with carpenter Thomas McFarland, he founded the Western Machine Works around 1858. His first product was a foot-powered mortising machine for woodworkers, but Steptoe understood that the real money was in metal. By 1870, the works employed 300 men building metalworking shapers, milling machines, and copies of the Putnam lathe. The business failed in 1878 and was reorganized, but the lineage it created outlived the company by a century. The industrial historian Joseph Wickham Rowe, writing in 1916, said that Cincinnati tool building owed its start more to Steptoe than to anyone else, with the possible exception of William Lodge, who was himself one of Steptoe's workmen. That sentence captures something essential about how the Midwest machine tool industry grew. Not through corporate planning or government investment, but through one man training another, who then trained another, each generation carrying the accumulated knowledge of the one before it into a new shop, a new company, a new specialization. William Lodge, born in England in 1848, arrived in Cincinnati in 1872 and spent 8 years as foreman under John Steptoe. He learned everything Steptoe could teach about building machine tools, then formed his own partnerships, eventually establishing Lodge and Davis in 1886 to build lathes and other machine tools. By the early 1890s, Lodge and Davis was exporting beyond its capacity. According to the Machine Tool Hall of Fame, about half the firms in Cincinnati in 1900 were strongly influenced by Lodge. He did not just build his own company. He helped start other companies to meet the demand his own firm could not fill. That generosity with knowledge and with orders was one of the defining characteristics of the Cincinnati machine tool ecosystem. The companies competed fiercely, but the founders had often trained together, and they understood that a rising tide of machine tool demand would float every shop in the city. When Lodge sold his interest in 1892, the remaining partners reorganized as Davis and Egan, which later became American Tool Works, builders of the heavy-duty pacemaker lathe. Lodge himself partnered with Murray Shipley to found the Lodge and Shipley Machine Tool Company in 1892, with a motto 3 words long, "Good lathes only." They dropped every other product line and committed to building lathes so precisely proportioned that machinists would speak the company's name with respect for the next century. A few miles away, another story was unfolding that would outlast them all. In the 1870s, a German immigrant named George Mueller had inherited his father's small Cincinnati shop, making sewing machine parts and fasteners. He brought in his friend Fred Holes, a machinist of considerable ability. Around 1878, the two men needed a milling machine for threading operations, but could not afford to buy one. So Holtz built one from scratch. He added innovations that showed real engineering instinct, including a centralized control panel and micrometer dials on the adjustment levers that allowed 2 adjustments simultaneously. The machine was so good that other shops started asking to buy copies. In 1884, they incorporated as the Cincinnati Screw and Tap Company. Fred Holtz's homemade milling machine won an award at the Cincinnati Industrial Exposition that same year. 3 years later, a 21-year-old named Frederick A. Geyer walked into the shop. Born June 23, 1866 in Cincinnati, the grandson of a German immigrant who had come through New Orleans in 1851, Geyer had grown up around his father Philip's barrel-bung woodworking shop. He was sharp with numbers, fluent in German, and restless. After his father died, he took a job at a bank in Newton, Kansas, hired specifically for his German language skills to serve the Mennonite farming community. He was good at it, but when he returned to Cincinnati in 1887 to settle his father's estate, a debt collection visit to Cincinnati Screw and Tap changed the course of his life. Fred Holtz showed him the milling machine. Geyer saw something nobody else had seen. The milling machine was a better business than the screws. He bought an investor's share for $7,000 and began pushing the company to abandon its screw and tap business entirely. In early 1889, the stockholders agreed. They sold the screw business to a group of employees and renamed the company the Cincinnati Milling Machine Company. The locals would call it the Mill. In its first decade, the mill fought through the financial panic of 1893 and 2 forced relocations caused by flood and fire. Geyer kept the company alive through sheer persistence, convincing his workers to weather the crisis alongside him when orders dried up and payroll could barely be met. By the turn of the century, the company had survived, stabilized, and begun to build the reputation that would carry it to the top of the industry. One more founder belongs in this chapter. Richard Knight LeBlond was born April 23, 1864 in Linwood, then a suburb of Cincinnati. He served a 5-year apprenticeship at the Franklin-type foundry on Vine Street, studied mechanical drawing at night at the Ohio Mechanics Institute, then worked as a journeyman machinist in St. Louis before spending time at Brown & Sharp in Providence, Rhode Island. He returned to Cincinnati in 1887, the same year Geyer bought into the Screw and Tap Company, and opened a 3-man shop on Pearl Street, making type molds, gauges, and small tools. In 1891, Lodge and Davis Machine Tool Company placed an order with LeBlanc for lathe attachments and 12-inch lathes. A historical study later called that order the beginning of the LeBlanc Company as a producer of machine tools. Nicholas Chard, a superintendent at Lodge and Davis, left around the same time to partner with LeBlanc and encouraged him to design his own lathes. By 1892, LeBlanc had produced his first own design, a 14-inch engine lathe. The R.K. LeBlanc Machine Tool Company would go on to build lathes that bored and rifled the guns of 2 world wars. By 1900, the pieces had converged. Cincinnati Milling Machine, Lodge and Shipley, R.K. LeBlanc, American Tool Works, and the descendants of Steptoe and Greenwood were all building machine tools within a few square miles of each other. Their factories lined the Mill Creek Valley and the Camp Washington district along Spring Grove Avenue and Coleraine Avenue, close enough that a machinist could walk from one plant to the next in the time it took to smoke a cigarette. The supply chain was local. The castings came from Cincinnati foundries. The cutting tools came from Cincinnati toolmakers. The skilled labor came from Cincinnati's German neighborhoods, where fathers trained sons and shops competed for apprentices the way other cities competed for bank clerks. In Cleveland, Warner and Swayze, Bardens and Oliver, and National Acme anchored a parallel cluster on the east side, near Carnegie Avenue and the railroad yards. In Milwaukee, Kemp Smith was training the men who would soon found Kearney and Trecker. In Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, Giddings and Lewis had been building boring mills since before the Civil War. The Midwest machine tool belt was taking shape along the Great Lakes and the Ohio River, and Cincinnati was its capital. Perrin March founded the Cincinnati Shaper Company in 1898, adding another name to the growing roster. Henry Bickford had been building drill presses since 1874. G.A. Gray was shipping 6-ton planers, some of which survive today in the Cincinnati Museum Center, where a working belt-driven machine shop preserves the tools and the sounds of the era that made them. The geographic infrastructure of canal and river, the immigrant talent from Germany and England, the production discipline beaten into the region by the Civil War, the engineering genealogy from Pratt and Whitney and Hartford, and the founders, men like Greenwood, Warner, Swayze, Lodge, Geyer, Holtz, and LeBlanc, who each refused to let their companies die when the easy choice was to quit. All of it had converged within a 100-mile radius of the Ohio River. Cincinnati was, by the turn of the 20th century, widely recognized as the machine tool capital of the world. The little milling machine company that Frederick Geyer saved in 1893 was about to become something much larger. In 26 years, the Cincinnati Milling Machine Company would be the largest machine tool builder in America. Across 5 Midwest cities, the bloodline from Hartford and the foundry culture from Cincinnati were about to produce the most extraordinary concentration of industrial capability the world had ever seen. And the next chapter of that story begins with a bet placed on the morning Admiral Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay.